All right, thank you, Gord. Thank you for the organizers, and it's really an honor to share the stage and share a symposium with scientists as well respected as Dr. Giesbrecht and Dr. Kenny. It's also a frightening honor to have to try to follow their awesome talks, but we'll try to do our best. So I'm going to switch gears. It's somewhat related to what Dr. Kenny is talking about in terms of heat stress for, in a way, the everyday individual. I'm going to focus more on the individual who is working also every day. So we're going to try to look at some of the newer technology, some of the newer ideas coming out in terms of how to keep those workers cool during very hot environments, both during heat waves and also just because of what they have to wear every day. So this study, looking at overall heat stress and how it affects individuals over the course of a working day, discusses both physiological changes and also psychological changes. What we have to keep in mind is a lot of accidents in the workplace doesn't necessarily happen because people keel over from heat exhaustion. They happen because they're not paying attention, their mental performance is impaired, they are a bit distracted and aren't looking at a forklift coming down the ramp. So there's also that mental component, and that part is pretty hard to quantify also in addition to just the basic physiology. There's also the problem of the fact that they are going to be impaired at work over the course of an 8-hour or 10-hour, sometimes 24-hour shift, if we're talking about a lot of first responders such as firefighters. But it also affects them as they go home and the rest of kind of their non-working day and their non-working lives also. So there could be long-term health risks just from daily hot exposures at work that we're really only starting to grab a handle on now, and that impact is really unknown. The main message from this graph is really that there's a lot of different components of heat stress within the occupational environment that we have to take into measure. Just an example, following up on what Dr. Kenny was talking about in terms of the effect of heat on our ability to function, in this case in the occupational. This is a study that came out in 2014 looking at, in Ontario, the emergency room visits based on the ambient temperature. As Dr. Kenny pointed out, there's a lot of problems with how we quantify ambient temperature. In this case, it was just the operating environment in general in that region. But what we have on the x-axis is the ambient temperature. What we have on the y-axis is the number of hospital visits on the left axis. And you'll see that it generally just it's pretty much flatline. There's not that much of a problem until we get to about 28 degrees wet bulb globe temperature. Then we really see a skyrocketing of the rate of hospital visits per full-time employee hours. So even though the absolute number of visits may drop because it's pretty rare to get these environments, most of the time the absolute rate increases quite a bit. But again, the main take-home message is as it gets hotter, there's greater risk of acute health effects. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, what we really don't know is the long-term chronic health effects in addition. As a further example, this is actually some of Dr. Kenny's excellent work looking at mining industry. And what we have here is he did a really excellent job of separating out different aspects of mining, from everything from just transport in largely a mechanized vehicle where there's minimal physical activity, through to production drilling and different shooting of concrete onto the walls, manual bolting of the screens, and just general service work, and also conventional mining itself. What we have here, again, with the categories is the amount of time over a full shift that is spent at different temperatures. So we have from their core temperature being 37 degrees all the way up to 38 degrees or higher. And what we see is, depending on the job, there can be wide variability in what heat stress the individuals are being exposed to. From the easiest in terms of thermal profiling would be the manual shotcrete, followed by the production ore transport, with the very hardest ones being the production drilling, where they're spending a huge amount of time at or above 38 degrees, which, by the way, is the standard threshold for most occupational standards. We don't want individuals spending time above 38 degrees over the course of the workday. So again, the main message here is that there's a lot of variability in the work, but that even in a mining aspect, there is a huge amount of heat stress that can be built up. This is compounded by the fact that they're wearing anywhere, depending on their job, from 10 to 22 kilograms of clothing, protective garment, and also additional work tools. So that's the overall kind of general profile of the average production kind of driller. But if we look more carefully, there is also individual variability in how the same environment may cause different responses across different individuals. So what we have here is manual bolting and also production drilling. Again, production drilling was the hardest, hottest work that we found in the previous slide. And what we have is the dark line is a mean value for their temperature over the course of that 8 hours or more of work, including the lunch break. We also have the lowest, kind of the least responsive individual, the coolest individual, if you want to talk about happy days in the fawns. These would be the guys who had the best response to that thermal stress. This would be the value for the individual who was the hottest, who had the worst response thermally to, again, manual bolting and up here production drilling. The things I want to point out is that there is, again, wide inter-individual variability. So when we're looking at heat stress, it's important not just to look at mean values or peak values, because peak values can be very misleading. It could be just one short spike, or it can be even though their peak value here, for example, may only just touch or go above 38 degrees, they're spending a lot of time at or very near that actual thermal limit. So we got to develop better monitoring and better standards for individuals, not necessarily just assume that an entire group response is adequate. So again, that just raises how do we actually go about monitoring individuals? Hopefully, as I'll talk about later today, there will be ideas about how to develop better non-invasive sensors of core temperature, of heart rate, of different physiological strain, and to develop systems that can really respond in real time. So this was produced by the Defense Organization in Singapore. This is what they give their soldiers and their commanders. But these are general heat mitigation strategies for both the public and for the athlete, recreational individuals, a lot of soldiers. So you can go with aerobic fitness training, and some of my PhD studies definitely showed that if you are very aerobically fit, you generally responded much better to heat, and you kept a cooler temperature throughout. And in my talk on Saturday for the keynote, I'm going to focus on heat acclimatization and also pre-exercise cooling. But in the workforce, what we really have to play with is we have rest and work schedules, which has a productivity cost, because anytime that individuals aren't working, theoretically, there's less productivity. And as was pointed out by Michael Joyner earlier, that was the whole purpose of the Harvard kind of business school and the fatigue lab, to really improve productivity. We can do some other measures, such as implementing hydration strategies and also, again, combining nutritional strategies. So those are some of the basic common things that we can do. What we really want to do, though, with occupational setting is see if we can cool them, kind of monitor their response to any work and heat in real time, and then cool them again in real time at an appropriate level. So that's what the rest of this talk is going to be about with microclimate cooling. So there's a few options when we try to develop personal cooling suits, and we'll talk about different variations throughout, but we have our standard liquid cooling garments. We have phase change materials. You've seen them in athletes. You've seen cyclists or rowers warm up with ice vest. Phase change materials is just a more high-tech version of an ice vest. We can combine that with ventilation of the garment underneath and ideally blow out the hot air from underneath any clothing and away from any clothing that they're wearing. And then actually this is a much younger me messing around back in my early days as a faculty member, messing around with thermo-electric modules. And we'll talk a little bit about them, but in a roundabout way, I'm starting to mess around with them now 20 years later. So the first big question is, do these even work? Is it effective to have microclimate cooling? And Albert Chen in Hong Kong has done a lot of work in this area, and he produced a meta-analysis on different cooling modalities for microclimate cooling. So the next few slides, I'm going to go over some of his data. I'm also going to talk about each mode of cooling. So the first is, again, liquid cooling garments. They were first developed in the 60s for NASA to wear underneath the spacesuits, and you may have seen them if you've seen The Martian or seen other astronaut movies. That's the kind of tube-lined suit that they're wearing underneath. It needs to be tight-fitting so that you can get the cold water right next to the skin. The challenge with it is you can have some regionalization. You can have different areas of the body being cooled more than others, which is a good thing. We want to be able to customize the cooling as best as we can so that it extracts heat at the most efficient places. So you can do that somewhat by altering how you stitch the tubing, whether you have more tubing on the chest or more on the arms, more in the legs, etc. So you can do that, but you're also somewhat limited by the fact that you generally just have one tube going in and one tube coming out. So it's a closed system, so you may have the coolest water coming in right at the inlet, but then by the time it gets to the outlet, it may be very warm and not really conducting much heat. The tubing itself is also quite inefficient because it is typically a round Tygon tubing, so there's really minimal surface area that is actually contacting the skin. So I know in the lab when we use it, to get any kind of cooling, we really have to crank down the temperature to about 5 degrees Celsius to get a skin temperature about 28 to 30 degrees to really affect some cooling. So that's a lot of heat energy and relatively inefficient use of power. But the big question is, first, does it work? And I'm assuming most of you have seen the general idea of a forest plot with a meta-analysis, but here is the zero effect. And what the evidence, the limited studies that have been done generally show is that there is a significant improvement compared to a control condition when you are wearing a liquid cooling garment. And these were all studies looking at performance measures rather than did their heart rate or did their core temperature decrease. So in general, despite their kind of technical problems, liquid cooling can be efficient and can be effective. The other option is phase change materials. Again, think of an ice pack. An ice pack works by really transferring a lot of heat from your body to melt the ice and turn that solid water into a liquid form. And phase change materials can tune that temperature at which that transition from solid to liquid happens away from necessarily just 0 degrees. So you have that tunable threshold, and so you would have it whether in a solid pack form or ideally embedded into a tight-fitting clothing so that you can get it really nice and tightly fitted to the body. The temperature from your skin will melt the phase change material, and you'll get rid of heat that way. So that's the theory of how phase change material works. Obviously, unlike a liquid cooling kind of tubing, you can have highly regional distribution, so you can really design where you want to put those packs, both to fit the thermal physiology and also to fit the ergonomics of the design. But again, same challenge is you really need a tight fit. If you're using big, bulky gel packs, that can really interfere with the overall ergonomics. And obviously, you have a finite duration. Once it has melted, then it's no longer conducting any heat away, and you need to have a constant supply. So there is that decreasing efficiency over time. But again, in general, the studies that have been done show an improvement overall on a large part, and a lot of work is going on in terms of the different types of phase change materials to really maximize that time and their heat capacity, and also how long they can be stored, how tightly they can fit to the body, etc. Another option that we have is fan cooling, is really ventilating. And as I was researching this article, I came across a pretty interesting and funny blog post about ventilation inside professional mascot suits. So if you're a professional mascot and running around with a big furry headpiece and all suited up, how do you try to keep cool? And one of the main ideas they suggested is fan cooling, and to blow the hot air ideally out of the garment. So that's the general theory. You're carrying around a little fan inside your clothing, and ideally it is not just blowing air around within your protective clothing itself, but it is ventilating it outwards. The challenge with it is that there's no regionalization. You're just going to have a fan and it's going to be blowing evenly everywhere. It is obviously going to be very bulky. You can see from this stylized drawing that you're essentially looking like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, or Michelin Man. So it can be very challenging to incorporate that into your ergonomics. And again, there's a large power draw. So again, it does seem to work. You can blow just normal air, or ideally you would be blowing cold air through. The other thing you can do is you can try to have neck cooling collars, and they're used by a lot of athletes. Generally, they don't seem to work that well. There's limited actual cooling. Most of the benefits seems to be perceptual. Okay, and the newest idea is some people are playing with is this idea of thermo-electric modules. They're used a lot in cooling computers, etc. And the idea is that with these special conductors that you run electricity through, and it will cause one surface to be cold, and that will be the side you'd leave next to your skin, and it will draw away heat from you. The challenge is, the good thing is theoretically it's infinitely tunable, but the challenge is that you have electricity, you have wiring that you may not want in all work situations. Right now, most of the material is very solid, so it's very challenging to incorporate into clothing. So those are the different modalities, but anytime you have microclimate cooling, you have side effects. The main thing is you have extra weight that's involved, which means more heat production. You also are interfering with your body's natural thermal regulation, mainly with sweating and also with conduction. So those are different issues that you have to face. So for example, with the cooling system, you're increasing a lot of mass. Every kilogram counts. Some modeling suggests that every kilogram increases 2 to 3% your metabolic rate, and also your energy requirements and heat production. And this is also really highly energy dependent, depending on if you're just sitting there or if you're really being active with your work. You're also having extra layers, as I mentioned. It can be very bulky, and each layer causes additional friction, and you are again increasing the energy cost and increasing the negative aspects. along with the motion restriction, again, the tight fit, can really alter your biomechanics. The other challenge, besides just the weight, is that you're interfering with sweating. If your skin is cool, even though your core temperature is driving your sweating, and it's one of the main drivers, if your local skin is cold, you're still not going to be sweating that much. This is a study from George Havanus' lab in Loughborough in England, and what they're looking at is, this is for males and females, the sweat distribution of pattern, the spatial distribution over the front and the back of the two sexes. So the big question with when you're using phase change materials or you're using cooling, whoops, let me just try to go back. The red arrow, okay? So, if this, for example, on the lower back of the male is your prime spot for sweating, do you actually want to put a cooling module there and theoretically decrease the amount of sweating? So those are challenges as we start to model and develop some of these cooling garments. Or do we want to put it where there's minimal sweating going on, but on the same time, maybe you're also not drawing much heat away as a result? So the one study that has been done looking at when you actually model the effectiveness of cooling, what we have is they have assumed these parameters, that it's increased by 2.5 kilograms because of the weight of the phase change packs, and they're decreasing the sweat rate, decreasing the skin temperature. So this is the theoretical cooling without any of the drawbacks, and this is the modeled skin temperature over the site with the drawbacks. It's still better than not having anything, but the main message is whenever we design something, we have to include the negative effects that are in there also. So that leads to the question, where do we optimize? How do we go about optimizing it? This was another study that actually just came out this year, looking at if you had anywhere from 0 to 20 of these phase change packs, how do you go about modeling where is the best place in the body to put them? So the idea that they wanted to have to model is that they obviously want to keep core temperature under 38 degrees, and then they wanted thermal comfort to be slightly uncomfortable but not really bad. They wanted to melt and use up all of the material in a certain amount of time in terms of the cooling. So what they came up with, they modeled what would happen with 28 degrees over 2 hours of work, and also a very hot environment, 45 degrees over 45 minutes of work. So at the end, they modeled the case that in this environment, to match the parameters, you only needed 8 modules, whereas if you were in a very hot environment, to make it only 45 minutes, you're gonna need all 20 of these modules. So the main message I want to impart here is there's no one size fits all, and there's going to be a lot of mathematical modeling that's going to be needed to really optimize the system. Another thing that we want to look at is really, is there a difference in the regional efficiency? We talked a little bit about, is there the best place over the whole body to remove the heat or not? And again, very limited work done. This was done by Victor Kocheyev, really for the astronaut program, and he developed an 8-zone liquid cooling garment of different sites. And what he was able to do was a really nice study. He essentially went and heated up or cooled down one zone at a time and kept the other zones at 33 degrees to try to look at, is there an optimal site on the body to cool individuals? So this is somewhat hard to see, but we'll look at really just the 8 degrees Celsius graph, but he tested it from 8 degrees up to 45 degrees of cooling. And but the main thing is that depending on whether you're at the torso or the hands or the heads, there's different thermal profiles depending on how much cooling that you really want. And the other challenge is that when you normalize the values, the torso, the thigh, the really big, large areas actually don't extract much heat. You extract a lot of heat from the hands and the feet, but they may not be the most effective in terms of you actually have to use your hands, you have to use your feet, and there's really overall relatively limited surface area. The other challenge that he found was that depending on different individuals, he had 6 individuals, each individual had their own individual thermal profile. Of some had more heat extraction from the torso, others had more from the thigh, so the arrangement was quite different. So do we need to model that also into an individual? So the other challenge is, okay, now we have different ideas of how to cool everything. How do we go about designing when we turn something on, when we turn something off, if we design a smart system? So one idea is to look at, can we control it by skin temperature? This was a study done by the US military. They looked at constant cooling, where the cooling was just on the whole time. They looked at a pulse cooling, where it was on, off at a steady time, or whether it was based on skin temperature, whether it was they turned it on whenever the skin got to 34.5, turned it off at 33.5. The end result was that in all 3 modes, they found no difference in core temperature. They found some difference in skin, no difference in heart rate. The big difference they found was in the power draw. They found that if you use this post-skin cooling system based on skin temperature, you got just as good thermal response, but at about half of the power draw, which means that you don't only have to look at the cooling effectiveness, you need to look at power draw also when you design these systems, which leads to a lot of modeling on how to develop the ideal heat strain estimation. So you can use artificial neural networking to throw in a whole bunch of parameters to model a rating of perceived exertion. You couple that with heart rate, and you end up with a decision, and you end up with a real time, whether they were in a safe mode, caution, warning, or in a really severe system. So you need to build that ideally into a smart personal cooling system. So, but ultimately, what I think we really need to step towards is a real smart, real-time monitoring of a whole bunch of variables. You need to have individuals who are maybe moving from place to place, and you would be able to get their environmental conditions, their activity levels, and also their biofeedback at any time. And you need to come up with real-time warning that they would have. They would automatically control the cooling, and ideally it would also go to supervisors who can see that in real time too and take those individuals out, take preventative measures as needed. So in summary, the field of microclimate cooling is really in its infancy. There's a lot of technological innovation that's required. There's a lot of optimization and mathematical modeling that's required. And ultimately, I feel it needs to really be produced into an entire system. So I'll just finish off by plugging my next talk on Saturday, which is the Gord Sleevert talk and keynote. And in honor of him, and also the fact that Human Kinetics is an exhibitor next door, I have my new cycling science book out. And if you find me on Facebook, there is a contest for a free copy of the book that's signed. And the question really is, how many papers did Gord Sleevert and I co-author together? So find me on Facebook. First one with a comment gets the book. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. So we have just a couple of minutes for 1 or 2 questions. Any questions? Yep.
It's wonderful to see you up there, Stephen, talking about this work that has progressed so much. My hair is grayer than yours. And in the 1980s, we were employing microclimate cooling operationally in our military for the use of pilots of helicopters who were at that time deployed to the Persian Gulf. And then as late as 2007, I was presented with a similar problem to you described. Canada had rented Leopard tanks and forgot that they needed air conditioning when they sent them over to Afghanistan. and there was no room for the air conditioning from an electrical power draw, from an engineering perspective, to actually be incorporated in those tanks. And we were asked if we come up with a solution, and we used microclimate cooling at that point in time. Quite effectively, no monitoring of anything other than to allow the crew themselves to adjust with an analog adjuster the flow of the liquid microclimate cooling suits they were using. So I guess my question is more of a combined question and commentary. Why isn't perception as the best of the user, the best way, rather than depending on a system to allow people to self-regulate microclimate cooling rather than the system approach that you've suggested? Pretty simple, seems to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think perception does and can play a role in it, but I think the ultimate idea would be if we can not even need them to be thinking, oh, am I hot right now? Am I cold right now? Do I need, it just removes that train of thought, or they're having to make an extra decision would be one of the ideas behind it. And yes, I absolutely agree that perception can play a role, but I think it's really to add to that automation level and also to provide that real-time kind of feedback to kind of monitoring crews, so that I'm mainly thinking of it in an ultra-deep mining situation where it's really hard to extract the individuals, and they may be moving all around in a portable environment, unlike where they may be in a stationary environment, like with a tank or with a helicopter, where you can have kind of, in a sense, unlimited power draw, or relatively to a mobile individual.